Hillary, I thought of you yesterday because I didn't know about this. My brother sent me a link to the Shloshim for Rabbi Jonathan Sachs.
I watched in the evening. It was amazing. Amazing.
Yeah, it was really a Kiddush Hashem to
We've just been talking about that. Such a Kiddush Hashem.
Sure
I knew that some of the people there, I know these people, even though I haven't been in England for 40 years. And it was beautifully spoken, beautifully done. Probably seemed very English to you.
Yes, very English, but it was to hear Prince Charles say Yehi Zichro Baruch was pretty amazing. It was really very nice. I'm sure it's available. People can see it.
It's on YouTube.
It's a little bit long, but it's nice.
Okay, can everybody
hope everyone is with. I wanted to begin with what we left off. Where someone had brought up last week, the issue of Art Scroll and the I guess controversy surrounding the production or the dissemination of Art Scroll Gemara and the like and things like that. And while I'm not coming to certainly not take an opinion and not take a stand and not here to defend, but to explain and maybe understand some of the thought processes of those people, of those Roshei Yeshiva, who were not for Art Scroll, which is hard for us to understand, seeing the proliferation of learning that has come as a result of Art Scroll and the availability of texts in English, so many texts and so much availability. It's hard to understand. But again, not to say that not to take any position, but to broaden, maybe give a little insight into it. I would say as follows. Torah, we have Torah given to us as Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, the written law and the oral law, and it deserves thought. The question of why and what's the significance of the oral law, and we find in different places that there's a certain distinction. There's Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh. Even in the Mishkan, the Aron representing Torah Shebichtav and the menorah, the light of the menorah, representing, according to certain sources, the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Hanukkah in general, and maybe we'll come back to Hanukkah today also, is often talked about, rabbinic holiday and symbolizing and holding in it ideas relating to Torah Sheba'al Peh. But we ask ourselves a very simple question: why did there have to be a Torah Sheba'al Peh? Couldn't it all have been written? Now, on a very basic level, someone can say, well, no, it couldn't have all been written. It was too long. There's so much Torah Sheba'al Peh. It wasn't possible. Maybe there's something to that. Then it would be a lot for it to be written. But the question, I think, is sharpened by the fact that it seems that Torah Sheba'al Peh was supposed to remain an oral law, to a point where, while we know that the various Chachmei Hadorot throughout the generations, the way it's explained, even by Rishonim, that they had private notes which they kept to themselves to help them remember the oral law. And there was nothing which was written down formally until Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, as we know, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rebbe, as he's affectionately known as, wrote down the Mishnah. He and the people who he worked with, they put down Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, the 6 orders, where they codified all law and put it in an ordered, written fashion, which is the Mishnah, which we have till today. There were others who wrote down Braitot, which were from the same time period, have no less authority, really, than the essentially than the Mishnah, except that were not included in the Mishnah, but they're given weight as well. And but until that time period, things were not written down to be formally written down. Not only that, the Gemara tells us that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's decision to write down the Mishnah was not a simple decision. And there was a sense of that which is oral law should remain oral law, and it should not be written law, and it should not be written down. And it was only because the Gemara says, quoting the famous pasuk, Eid la'asot l'Hashem heferu toratecha. Fascinating pasuk, that sometimes for the sake of doing for God, for the sake of preserving our people, our tradition, we have to deviate from what the Torah should be. Eis la'asos l'Hashem, it's a time to do for God. Heferu sorasecha. Writing down Torah sheba'al peh was considered heferu torasecha, is compared to, in some ways, lahafer, canceling, negating, deviating from what the Torah should be. So if it was just a matter of convenience, it's too long to write, and therefore you need an oral Torah, it wouldn't seem that there would be something inherently detrimental or negative with writing the Torah, with writing Torah Sheba'al Peh. And from the fact that there was, it seems that there should be something which should be an oral Torah. And then we come back to the question which I asked at the beginning, is why should that be? So I want to present to you a couple of thoughts about why we would need and why there should be specifically an oral Torah, a Torah Sheba'al Peh. One idea which I would share with you. One idea is that the Torah Sheba'al Peh requires a connection between generations. The fact that it's an oral law, we're not the only religion that has oral traditions. Various cultures and religions throughout the ages have had oral traditions. An oral tradition keeps the connection between the generations. The grandparents, would give over to the parents, to the children, to the grandchildren, the oral tradition. It created a sense of connectivity between the generations. The fact that there was an oral law, you can't just, read it, but there has to be this value and connection with the generations that came before us. That's one idea, I think, which is super important when it comes to the oral law. We had last night, I don't know if anybody was, but in the boys' school, if you have grandchildren in Orot Zion Banim, they had a wonderful program last night, a Yom Sababa, which they had a Zoom with about 180 people on it, grandparents all over the world and their grandchildren in the boys' school, and they hired a company to do a Chidon Tanakh, a Chidon Chanukah, which was really, really, really well done. It was seeing all the pictures of the grandparents and the kids and the grandchildren was very special. We certainly see that Torah Sheba'al Peh helps us to create that. And the other idea, which I think relates to the question about Art Scroll, particularly, is the fact that there's an oral tradition helps to create a system where people have to be connected. It's hard to be a self-made man with a Torah Sheba'al Peh. That you need, the idea of the academy, the yeshiva, the tutorial system of chavrusas, where you have to learn with others, and you have to have a mentor, a rebbe. And we certainly believe in people I don't think, some people will say, and I don't know, that the yeshiva system was elitist. Maybe in some ways it might have been in some people will say that, okay, even some people here. We, in terms of our tradition, I can't speak for the system, but I can speak for the sources, being the people of the book. It's not for naught that we are called the people of the book, and that people throughout the ages, some of our greatest leaders and teachers were people who came from, it wasn't always from the rabbinic families that the leaders came. It wasn't until I actually listened to a lecture not too long ago that it wasn't until the early 1800s that there was this idea of the Rosh Yeshiva's son became the next Rosh Yeshiva. It didn't always. Now we do have the dynasties of Rabban Gamliel throughout, Bayit Sheni and the Kohen. There were something where certain leadership positions where it went down in a dynasty, certainly the Melucha, the Kahuna, certain things, we do find that. But in terms of the academies of learning, again, I'm not a historian, I always say this, but from what I've heard or read, it was in the early 1800s that this started, that the yeshiva was like an ASEC, a little bit of business, where it was passed down, from son to you had to be blood to be the next Rosh Yeshiva. So there is, and there should be, at least in our Masorah. Now, whether or not this always carried out into the practical running of a yeshiva, but it shouldn't be that where the learning was only, I don't know of any movement to keep people illiterate in Judaism. We take pride in the fact that, the Gemara says in the time of Chizkiyahu HaMelech, even the children, even people, regular people knew various Sidrei Mishnah, and people were very learned people. We take pride in the learning, in being the people of the book. Now, again, whether it always carried on, I don't know. But this is not a matter of not being learned. It's a matter of, and this is, listen to this distinction, and accept it or don't accept it. I'm not pushing it. But the idea of, there's a danger in a self-made man. There's a danger of someone who can just have the book, not have a teacher, and not learn within an academy, and just be, completely from all my knowledge comes not from what they call dibuk chaverim at all. Now, independence of thought we value. There's no question about it. I hope we value independence of thought still in Orthodox Judaism. But I think that possibly what they were afraid of with things like the Art Scroll Gemara is that someone could be a completely self-made man. You can have your Gemara. You don't have to learn from share from a Rebbe, and they saw that as dangerous, and they saw that. Now, there were self-made men, and again, I'm not a historian, but I think certain leaders, Rabbi Steinsaltz to some extent, was a self-made man. There were other people who were also to some extent. So I would just offer this as a possible thought. And again, I'm not here to defend or justify. Please don't take it that way, or to say, yes, this was right, and we shouldn't have had Art Scroll. I think anybody, and probably those people who were against it years ago, when you see the learning that's taking place, the proliferation of people who are learning, it's hard to say that anybody in retrospect would have been or would be against it now. Yes.
But that's the problem is, in other words, you're right in retrospect, but I don't know why we have to have the retrospect, since we have already experienced what it's like when people are ignorant. The Jewish people, I'll talk about America right now, we are bleeding intermarriage and marrying out and the ignorance among the Jewish people. I don't think you needed, that's what I want to say. Maybe in the times of Yehuda Hanassi, I needed retrospect. I don't need retrospect. I'm just looking at, what do they say for the longest time? 6 million Jews in America, 6 million Jews. How come it's never gone up? It's never gone up because we are bleeding. And this isn't ace lassos. This, I understand the hesitations and I agree. And I know myself, I'm guilty of it. I can be lazy and pick up an art scroll Megillat root sometimes before I'll pick up the Hebrew one. But I don't think there's anybody that could say that this is not an eight lassot now. We are losing people.
Yeah, but on the other hand, we have to realize, especially those of us here who can speak Hebrew, that Art Scroll has an agenda. They don't translate some words correctly on purpose. They don't
that's true.
include
That's
some
true.
parts of the translation, or the Gemara misses chunks out because they don't want anything to do with Eretz Israel or Aliyah is not translated. It's not there. And it can be very annoying and very upsetting. So, which is why we should try and not to use Art Scroll if we can.
But some of that is our fault. If I sat down and wrote a Perush that was Tzioni, that's what I should be doing. So I can't blame them. I should say, you're right. They leave out things and it doesn't have it. So it's my obligation to write a different Perush then. So and we lost that person named Rabbi Sachs.
Yeah, which half the world wouldn't listen to. The Haredi world will listen to Art Scroll. They won't listen to anybody who's not Haredi. So
there's always what Rabbi
sorry, I'm taking over the chair. Judith.
There's retrospect. There's retrospect. Good old fashioned retrospect. Right. He'll have his time also.
Let Moshe
get on.
Let Rav Moshe get on with it. Okay.
All right. Getting on. Getting on to other topics here. So.
Why didn't you mute? I muted him.
Muted. No, you can't mute him.
Rav Moshe is muted now.
I'm good now. Okay, somebody didn't like what I said. Okay, I'm all right now. That's the advantage of Zoom. If you don't like what the teacher says, you could just mute them. So. No, certainly I started saying that nobody would disagree that anything, what we can do to keep people in the fold and to bring people back is so important. We have to be careful because even with that, we have to be careful because some people will propose, therefore we should loosen the laws of who we accept as Jews because we're losing people. So let's just bring people in. And I know you're not saying that. But, and in certain areas, there are maybe things that we should do, but go ahead, Debbie, you can have the last word, then we'll move on.
I want to say, besides Art Scroll today, they have all these shiurim in English, where the people, my husband listens to Daf Yomi in English every day, and he doesn't go to a chavruta, and he would not have been able to do this without it.
Yeah.
So they have all these, which you didn't have many years ago.
Right.
You didn't even have these, tapes 30 years ago, I don't think, so this is something that isn't not necessarily Art Scroll and that you have.
No, no, for sure. And I would just, the last thing I would say is that the idea of some consensus and, that develops because of scholarship, I think is important. No one appointed, Rav Moshe Feinstein because, and it took a little time, but people recognized and accepted, and he was part of the system where he was accepted as the posek or, hador, amongst lots of Jews. The Hasidim had trouble with that at the beginning. The Satmar Rebbe was not a fan. But it's because of being part of the system, and nowadays everybody goes off on their own thing. I think there's something, again, I value certainly individuality, individual thought, but being, and some parts of our system, as somebody, said here, it can be very narrow, unfortunately, and you know, it's sad that that happens. You know, I don't know if I said this, but I'll just say it, and I do want to move on. That in terms of the narrowness, my Rosh Hashiva from Ner Yisrael, Rav Yaakov Weinberg, Zichrono Livracha, who's a brother of Rabbi Noach Weinberg, who I've quoted him before, and he was a brilliant man, and he was my Rosh Hashiva. So but he, you know, he said, I remember him saying that, you know, we always think in terms of the Jewish people being impacted and influenced by the world we're around it, but part of being the Am Segula is impacting the world, and we see that in terms of our being the dispersal and the values. And you look at the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and you see that impacting the world. But he spoke about it happening sometimes in a way which is almost metaphysical. That if we show a certain, you know, a good direction or a bad direction, that can impact society, the greater society. The Jewish part of being the Am Segula is that if we become weak in a certain area, that can impact and have ripple effects, which amongst the entire world. What he talked about, again, you could take this or leave this, but he spoke about in the early 1900s, the Jews in America, there was certainly a, you know, in terms of separation of men and women, there was a laxity. I'm not talking about not publishing pictures of women here. I'm talking about social dancing at young Israel dinners, which was usual. And he speculated, and he said, you know, he wonders if the fact that this happened to the Jewish Orthodox community, well, I guess what maybe they call the sexual revolution in the world, and where the looseness of morals in a much greater way. Again, I'm not comparing social dancing with looseness of morals, please, you know. But he's saying the ripple effect affects the world in a greater way. That's what he said. I take it to a place where I look at the intolerance that exists now in the world. You can't say another opinion, where you can't listen, and there's a closed-mindedness to other opinions, you know, in everything in the world. Where you're shunned by saying, I'm going to vote for this person, or saying that I think that this is right. There's a lack of tolerance for a healthy kind of debate and discussion, and an openness to that we have in our community, unfortunately, in the Frum community. And we've seen, you know, I wonder if the fact that in the world, it just doesn't exist. Civil discourse, where you can say an opinion and disagree without being disagreeable, and without calling people, you know, when they say that the you know, the Tzionim are the Yevonim of old, or Amalek of old, it's so out of bounds, it's so out of control, and that kind of attitude, unfortunately, you see it, it's taken over the world, this kind of attitude. And I wonder if we might not be a little guilty of that also. I'm not talking about we're not guilty of anything, this group. This is a great group. Let me go on because our time is short. The Rambam, I want to do this chapter 6 in the Rambam, if you don't mind. And I want to get a little time to talk about Hanukkah. Chapter G, let's see, where is it? Shmona Prakim. You see it? Yeah? We able to see it?
Yes.
Okay, this Shmona Prakim Perek Shishi is it's almost like its own topic, which the Rambam talks about, which is a very interesting topic. And he, in this site again, where he gives he breaks it up and makes it a little bit more readable, the Shmona Prakim. Not that it's not readable, but he titles this chapter Ha'hefresh. I don't think this is the Rambam's title. I'm not sure. Ha'hefresh bein ha'me'ula ubein ha'moshel berucho. And he talks the topic is as follows. Is someone better if they don't have any desire to do the wrong thing? They naturally are inclined to be good people. Or are you on a higher level, quote unquote, better, if you have the desire to do bad things, but you control that desire? Who's on a higher level? And that's the topic of this chapter. And he starts with the da'at of the philosophim, which is basically that someone is on a higher level if they are drawn to do good. HaMoshel Berucho, he says, Shehamoshel Berucho im yaseh ha'ma'asim ha'ma'ulim, somebody who is a Moshel Berucho, who's able to control their desires. That's someone who, if they do the right things, Hareu she'osa ha'tov, v'hu mit'aveh, but he desires al ha'ma'asim hara'im, but he actually wants to do the bad things. U'mishtokek alehem, v'yichbosh yitzro, but he conquers his yetzer, v'hu mitnaged b'ma'asehu, and he, in his actions, goes against what he actually desires. L'masha yesitu kocho v'ta'avato utchunat nafsho, what that which his natural inclination, desires, and personality pulls him to, he controls. V'yasa hatov, nevertheless, v'hu nizak be'asoto. Aval ha'me'uleh, but someone who's in mu'ulah is nigrar b'ma'asav. Achar ta'avato utchunato, is someone who naturally wants to do the right thing. And the philosophers say, it says the Rambam, Hiskimu ha'filosofim, sha'me'ula yoter chashuv yoter mushlam. Who is more complete, more mushlam? Someone who desires to do the right things. All right? And somebody who has to fight against them is on a lower level. Daragato pichuta be'echreach. Because you want to do the bad, you're actually not as shalem, you're not as complete. And the Rambam then brings psukim to back this up, this direction. He says, Divrei Hanaviyim v'divrei Chazal kvar amar Shlomo kiyotze bazeh nefesh rasha ivtara'a. The soul of a wicked person desires bad. So, Sameach Tzadik, a pasuk in Mishlei also, Simchalat Tzadik asot mishpat. It does gladness, happiness for a righteous person to do justice. Umechita lepoale aved. Ze masha mitgala midivrei hanaviyim hanaot lemasha zachru philosophers, which goes along with what the philosophers say. However, the Rambam then brings down certain of our statements, Chazal, which seems to indicate the opposite. Kol hagadol mechavero yitzro gadol himenu. The greater a person is, the greater is their yetzer hara. Or lifum tzara agra. We're all familiar with that, right? Based upon the effort and the tsa'ar that a person has to put in to doing the right thing or not doing the wrong thing, he gets rewarded for that. Seems to indicate that a person who is Moshel Berucho is a greater person, is a person who is able two things. Number one, it's an indication. Having a Yetzer Hara is not an indication of something bad. It's rather an indication of greatness. A great person can have great appetites as well, or great ta'avot as well. Not just in terms of the inclination, but also in terms of the bitzua, in terms of the way a person acts. Person who does the right thing because, and it causes them more tension, pain to do the right thing, more anguish, more difficulty, more effort, their reward is greater. Lefum tzara agra. It's telling us a person who has to fight the Yetzer Hara not to do something asur, is rewarded greater than the person who has no tava. So it seems to indicate the opposite. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, finally he brings, Lo Yomar Adam, a person should not say, this is a sifra, a medrash in Sefer, in Parashat Kedoshim. Lo Yomar Adam, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, a person should not say, I can never eat milk and meat. A cheeseburger, I could never, I would never want to wear shatnez. Ella, what should a person say? Efshi, I can, probably would be good. Ma'asev, well, what should I do? The avi shabashamayim gazar alai. My Father in heaven made a gezerah and told me that I can't do it. So we see that a person seems to indicate a little bit differently that a person's on a higher level if they can fight their Yetzer. And a person who has the Yetzer, it's not an indication of something wrong with you. It's rather an indication of greatness. A great person has a great appetite. The Rambam then works on resolving this stira, this contradiction. And he resolves it in a very interesting way. Very interesting. He basically says there are tzvei dinim. There are two different kinds of Yetzer Haras. There are two different kinds of moshel berucho. He says when it comes to moral issues, a person is on a higher level if they don't even desire to do something immoral. A person who has a taiva to steal from others and controls that taiva is not as shalem as a person who, in their heart of hearts, wouldn't want to steal from others because it's not right, because they have built in a sense of justice and what's right. So things which are moral and ethical in their nature, the Rambam says, it's actually to be better. Now, we can't necessarily always choose who we are. We can say, listen, I'm born this way, that I have a desire to steal. What can I do? But if we're talking about who is, hypothetically, again, we're not ranking people unless we keep lists of who's better people. But generally, we're saying that a person who does not even desire to do something immoral or unethical has reached a higher shleimut in terms of their human development, in terms of the development and their shleimut ha'enoshi, than a person who desires it but controls it. However, things which are not related to moral issues, such as a cheeseburger, a desire to something, which is just to get hana from something, which isn't a moral issue. There we say, no, there's nothing immoral about looking at the piece of bacon sizzling I always looked at the bacon sizzling on the frying pan. I know they sell fake bacon, but and you look at it and you say, wow, that looks good. I really would. There's nothing wrong with saying, I would love to have that. That would really, that would be great. What can I do? Like Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, Avisha b'shamayim gazar alai. There's nothing there. If a person has a flat personality and has no desire for enjoying life, that doesn't make them on a higher level. They're on the contrary. Somebody who has a robust desire built into their personality and yet is able to temper it and control it and direct it, that person may be on a higher level. That's the way the Rambam, it splits hairs. I don't know if it's quite splitting hairs, but it makes a lot of sense. The way he decides this question, where he says it depends. things which are ethical. Certainly, if we can build our personality that we don't want to do something morally or ethically wrong, that brings us up. But there's no mila of getting to a place where I say, yich, a cheeseburger, I could never do it. That doesn't show any higher level of avodas Hashem. If a person doesn't even have a desire for a cheeseburger, if a person doesn't even have a desire to do something unethical, then that does show a higher level that a human being has attained. That's the way the Rambam decides this issue. To me, what's interesting is that there are certain things which I've wondered, are they ethical or not? Are they, do they go against ethics, or is it something like eating a cheeseburger, or is it something like stealing? I'll give you an example. When I learned in Ner Yisrael, the Mashgiach, there was a Rabbi Moshe Eisenman, this is the Mashgiach, he's still there, I think, in Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. He was also an English in origin, and I remember him talking once, giving a shmooze there, a sicha, and he was saying that when he was a young bachur learning in, I don't know, Gateshead or wherever he was learning, he remembers that the guys were going around and they were asking each other the following question. They were saying, if there was one day when there was no Torah, no Averos, you could do whatever you want that day, what would you do? How would you spend that day? That's what they were asking each other. That was what the question they posed to each other. How would you spend the day if you had no constraints of the Torah? And whether he said, so that, we as, healthy yeshiva bachrim, 19, 20, 21 years old, we may have said certain answers, but he didn't go around the room. Thank God. He said, so what I said was that I would go to all of the old age homes where the old people are suffering, and I would shoot them. That's what he said he would do. And it was fascinating, because basically, he saw, at least he viewed, that euthanasia as not something ethically or morally wrong. And something where, again, I just, from what he said, I see it that way. And therefore, but what can I do? The Torah says that we don't have the control over human life. We can't take human life. And therefore, we can't put a person who Rahman al-Itzlan is undergoing even, all kinds of cases, again, terrible things, but we can't take it into our own hands. One could take a different position and could say it's ethically wrong, and ethically, morally, for a human to take a human life is like stealing. We don't have the right to do such a thing, and and that's why. So I have thought about this in the past, and I'm sure it's something to think about, whether mercy killing, as they used to call it, or whatever, is something which is morally wrong, or is it just halachically wrong? Anyway, that's the way the Rambam deals with this issue in terms of what's considered a person who is shalem. I want to take, just in the few minutes that we have remaining. I hope next time that we'll be able to do, I'm not going to do them completely. So that's really, you can see the end of the chapter, but that's pretty much what the Rambam says in the end of chapter 6. The Shmona Prakim leaves us with two Prakim left. And I hope I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I will next time hopefully wrap it up. The Rambam's Perush and the Rambam's introduction to his Perush, I should say, on Avos. I want to mention one other thing, and then I want to say something about the Ramban. We've talked about self-made men. My brother sent me a very interesting YouTube talk. It was I don't know if it was something of people who came from the Lower East Side to interest people, even though it's interesting to everybody. But the name of the talk is the movement or something, the campaign to discredit Rav Moshe Feinstein. And it was a talk given, I know I'm giving a lot of shout outs to England today. I don't know what's wrong with me, so I apologize. But the person who gave the talk is a Rabbi Pinney Dunner. Rabbi Pinney Dunner. He's a rabbi. His father, I think, was a dayan. Well, I know was a dayan, a big dayan in Britain, a dayan Dunner. Rabbi Pinney Dunner is a rabbi in some shul in California now. And if you, this talk was a very interesting talk. And from that, I know there's a bunch of other very interesting, I find them interesting at least, which this Rabbi Pinney Dunner, D-U-N-N-E-R, on the history of the Volozhin Yeshiva, on Moshe Montefiore, very, very nice, interesting to listen to. And in this talk about this movement to discredit Rav Moshe Feinstein, he talks about a sefer which he found called Ma'aneh Le'igros. The sefer Ma'aneh Le'igros was written by a Jew who lived somewhere in Pennsylvania or New Jersey. He was a genius of a Jew who learned in Yeshivat Chachmei Lublin in Europe. He doesn't talk only about this, but he talks about him and this book he wrote, which attacked sharply Rav Moshe Feinstein on a number of his tshuvot. And very harsh words. Now, it never gained much traction, this book, and it's hard to find. Apparently, he says, I didn't see it online, you can find this, but it's an attack, Ma'aneh Le'igros, an answer to the Igros. Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuvas for are called Igros Moshe. And there he really attacks Rav Moshe Feinstein. What's interesting about this man who wrote it, I think his name was Rav Yom Tov Schwartz, or I think that was his name. Again, he was clearly a Gaon, but he escaped the Holocaust. His entire family was wiped out. He went through terrible tragedies in the Holocaust. He was in, according to this video, 6 or 7 concentration camps. He got to America and he had no contact with anybody else. And he sees this book from this whippersnapper posek, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who came out with some very novel heterim, and he attacked him. He wasn't part of the system, this rabbi who wrote it. And I mention it because it sort of relates to what we talked about earlier of what I think is important of being part of the academy, being part of the system, that's sort of built in. If you get a chance to look at this Rabbi Pinney Dunner, any of his YouTube videos, again, I'm curious to know if anyone else finds it interesting. I found them very, I listened to a few of them, middle of another one, which I found very interesting. I want to just mention.
He also gave a beautiful tribute hesped to Rav Sachs.
Really?
Yes, they were personal. Right after Rav Sachs was nifter, he was one of the YouTube videos that came on as far as people that knew Rav Sachs personally and worked with him and were friends with him and lived near him and were in the same shul. And he really gave a most beautiful and meaningful hesped for Rav Sachs. It's also worth listening to. Okay,
thank you. I have not seen that. Thank you. I want to just mention something just very, very briefly. The Ramban mentions the Chashmonaim and Hanukkah in a few places in his commentary on Chumash. One of them is in Parshat Vayechi. And in Parshas Vayechi, in the bracha of Shevet Yehuda, each Shevet is given a bracha, or Yaakov's, the father's insight into them, who they were, their strengths, and sometimes their weaknesses as well. But he says about Yehuda has malchut. Lo yasur shevet mi Yehuda umechokek mi bein raglav ad ki avo shilo velo yikhat amim. That there is a certain leadership. The melucha will belong and should belong to Yehuda. And it doesn't mean, the Ramban explains, that there will never be any other kings. But the lasting melucha would be from once Yehuda came into the role of a melech, it stayed and should have stayed essentially with Yehuda. And explains why the first king had to come from Binyamin, because that was at a time when they requested a king not inappropriately, and that king, that melucha wouldn't last. And therefore, according to the Ramban at least, not everyone agrees with this. And that's why the first king was chosen from Shevet Binyamin. One could make a case that Binyamin was actually the perfect Shevet, and the ideal king should have been from Binyamin, but let's put that aside. He says, according to Yaakov Avinu, it belongs to Shevet Yehuda. And based upon that, the Ramban says that in this idea, the Chashmonaim erred, and they did wonderful things. And he says something, very, very beautiful words about the Chashmonaim, and that they Beit Chashmonai, they were punished because they took the melucha. They decided to make themselves king. They were, as we know, Kohanim, right? B'nei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. So the Chashmonaim were from a Kohanic family, and what they did in rededicating the Beit HaMikdash and battling and fighting, they didn't just wage a spiritual war. They waged a war for spirituality, but they waged a very physical war. But for them to then step in to the role as melachim, as kings, was something in which they according to the Ramban at least, they overstepped their role. And even though the Ramban uses beautiful words, and he says, they were, I'm just trying to look. Yes, he says, that they became kings in Bayit Sheni. Ki hayu chasidei elyon. They were chasidei elyon, says the Ramban. V'ilmaleihem, and if it wouldn't have been for them, l'shtakchu haTorah v'hamitzvot b'Yisrael, their war to regain the Jew leadership during the time of the Yevanim in Bayit Sheni. And what's interesting, and again, our time is pretty much over, but the Galut Yavan was, what's unique about the Galut Yavan is that it happened during the time of where the Jews were in Israel. The other Galuyot, the Jews were in exile. The exile of Yavan was with the Jews in Israel, but without the Shekhinah, without the Beit HaMikdash there. And therefore it's considered Galut Yavan. And during that time, the Chasidei Elyon did tremendous things to bring it back. And if it wouldn't be for the Aval Pikein, Ne'enshu Onesh Gadol, they were punished that their Melucha didn't last. He says other things here as well, again, which I don't have time to go into, but it was because they took the Melucha when they shouldn't. They were Levium, and they went into an area which they should have given it over. They shouldn't have taken the melucha for themselves at that point. What's interesting, and again, the Chashmonaim, and again, he calls them Chasidei Elyon, but he says they made an error here. But they fought, and they fought for the values and for the tarbut of Yahadut, and for the Torah, even at a time when Jews were in Eretz Yisrael, and he gives them credit for that, but he does say that they made a mistake here. I'll stop because I think I don't know if Rav Ruvain, who's coming on? Rav Ruvain?
Daphne.
Oh, Daphne's here. Okay, I apologize. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm going to